On May 18, 1980, after weeks of seismic unrest, Mount St. Helens erupted in the deadliest volcanic event in U.S. history, a massive landslide. Multiple pyroclastic flows, hot avalanches of gas and ash, and pumice flows all rushed down the mountain. Entire forests were destroyed. Mud flows roared through valleys, and thousands of surface and subsurface explosions rattled the region for days. The blast flattened hundreds of thousands of acres of forest, reshaped the mountain, and killed 57 people. But from the devastation came amazing scientific discoveries and the inspiring story of ecological recovery. Join us as we look back at the catastrophic eruption of Mount St. Helens in our series, The Day the Mountain Exploded. In the early morning hours of March 27, 1980, after months of increasingly frequent earthquakes, Mount St. Helens began to rumble. A magnitude 4.1 earthquake struck at 3:32 a.m., followed by another magnitude 4.2 quake minutes later. By the time the sun rose, more than 3,000 residents who had been awakened by the quakes looked out their windows to see a thin plume of steam rising from the mountain. But something was different. The earthquake swarm had changed things. The rumbling continued throughout the day, punctuated by puffs of steam. Local geologists knew that this meant magma was moving under the mountain. By late evening, local officials issued an alert telling people living near the volcano to be ready to evacuate. Overnight, people packed their belongings and headed south, away from the mountain. That night, they would not sleep in their beds again. A steady stream of small earthquakes continued for about 2 weeks. Then, on April 6th, the activity moved into high gear. Early in the morning, a strong earthquake shook homes for about 20 seconds. People reported feeling the house shake like never before. Later that day, the U.S. Geological Survey recorded a magnitude 5.1 earthquake. At 8:17 p.m., the public alert level went from watch to warning. By midnight, nearly all 15,000 residents had left the zone where they grew up. For some, it was their home for generations. They knew they might never see these places again. For the next week, Mount St. Helens continued to rumble with almost daily earthquakes of magnitude 4 or greater. By May 11th, steam and gas were escaping through a new vent on the north slope of the mountain. It was clear that something big was happening deep beneath the surface. The mountain was bulging. In some areas, the ground was pushing up as much as half a meter per day. Then, on May 17th, the bulge ruptured. As millions of tons of rock cracked open, the pressure released caused a huge landslide on the north side of the mountain. The slide area was roughly the size of Manhattan Island. The movement generated a giant avalanche that raced down the mountainside at over 175 kilometers per hour, sweeping everything in its path. The lahar traveled about 20 kilometers from the volcano, burying valleys and towns along the way. Most of the debris fell within a few hundred meters of the volcano, but some particles were lofted as high as 32 kilometers into the atmosphere. In the early morning hours of May 18, 1980, after several days of elevated seismic activity, a magnitude 5.4 earthquake struck. Moments later, a tremendous explosion ripped through the mountain. An estimated 240 million tons of rock and ash blasted into the air, creating the most violent volcanic eruption in U.S. history. In less than 10 minutes, the force of the blast flattened an area the size of San Francisco. Pyroclastic flows rushed down the mountainside, incinerating everything in their path. Hot avalanches of gas and ash surged into the valleys, destroying entire forests. Tall trees were snapped off at the base and hurled across the landscape. Pumice flows boiled through forests, scorching trees and stripping vegetation from the ground. By 10 a.m., the skies were filled with ash, which rapidly rained down over an area of 180,000 square kilometers. By 11 a.m., ash had already fallen in Montana, Idaho, and western Canada. The explosions continued for 9 days, accompanied by thick ash clouds and glowing avalanches. By May 25th, the rumbling was over, but the worst was not yet to come. During the summer, snow and ice melted on the mountain, sending torrents of mud cascading down the slopes. These lahars traveled as far as 80 kilometers from the volcano, burying whole valleys. Lahars destroyed bridges and roads, reshaped rivers, and deposited vast quantities of volcanic material into the Columbia River. The river rose, sending floodwaters crashing into the small towns of Carson and Trout Lake. Ash blanketed the landscape. Then the rain came. In some areas, it washed ash into rivers and streams. Elsewhere, it turned soil to thick, soupy mud that poured onto roads and into rivers. But in the end, rain also helped put out the fires ignited by the eruption. 1 year after the eruption, scientists began to assess the damage. 57 people had lost their lives. All were outside the official danger zone. 27 of the victims were killed by the landslide. Most others died when their cars hit mudflows in the lowlands. Their bodies were found in late summer when lahars receded. More than 250 homes and buildings were destroyed. Roads were buried, bridges were demolished. Hundreds of thousands of acres of forest were destroyed. But even in the aftermath of such devastation, there were signs of renewal. 2 weeks after the eruption, a green shoot poked up through the ash. By the end of July, lush new growth carpeted the hillsides. It was one of the most remarkable displays of ecological tenacity in history. Since the eruption, Mount Street, Helens has continued to steam and rumble. Scientists continue to monitor the mountain closely. Today, more than 30 years after the eruption, Mount Street, Helens, is a very different place than it was before. Its peak was blown completely off, leaving behind a large crater. The north face of the mountain is scarred by the giant landslide. New craters dot the landscape. Steam rises from vents in the crater floor. And visitors can walk among the blast zone, a stark moonscape of gray ash and twisted trees. The blast zone gives way, rises from vents in the crater floor, and visitors can walk among the blast zone to an eerie silence. It is a place without birdsong, a place where the ecosystem has just begun to stir back to life. Since the 1980 eruption, Mount Street, Helens has seen smaller eruptions and steam-driven explosions, but no one knows when the next major eruption will occur. When it does, it could be even more dangerous than the last. Much of the loose material left by the 1980 eruption could be swept into the river systems by melting snow and ice. Mudflows could race through the valleys with devastating speed. If another major eruption occurs while people are still living in the lowlands, many could die. The 1980 eruption of Mount Street, Helens unleashed more explosive energy than any other eruption in U.S. history. But since then, the area has seen remarkable ecological recovery. Lush forests now cover the slopes of the mountain. Elk, deer, and black bears roam the blast zone, and songbirds fill the trees with music. The eruption brought an end to an old-growth forest that had stood for centuries. Now, a new forest is growing in its place. In 2006, scientists used LiDAR scanning technology to create a detailed three-dimensional model of the mountain. By comparing the shape of the mountain before and after the eruption, they learned that the 1980 eruption removed about 1/10 of the total volume of the volcano. In 2004, researchers used a helicopter to map all of the features created by the 1980 eruption. Their findings helped scientists understand how the eruption changed the surrounding landscape. The May 18, 1980 eruption of Mount Street, Helens, was a pivotal moment in American history. It was the deadliest volcanic eruption in the country's history and the most violent event in the region's history since the last ice age. The eruption changed the lives of thousands of people and forever altered the landscape of southwestern Washington. But it also provided an unprecedented opportunity to study volcanoes. Because so many scientists were monitoring the mountain in the weeks and months before the eruption, they were able to learn more about what happened in the minutes and hours afterward than they ever could have imagined. The data they collected helped improve forecasts of future eruptions and save lives. Today, Mount Street, Helens National Volcanic Monument, preserves the blast zone of the 1980 eruption. and provides a place for people to learn about one of America's most powerful volcanoes. I've been your host from Epic Disasters. Explore more of our content on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories from Epic Disasters. Together, we remember the past so we protect the future. Stay informed, stay aware, and above all, stay safe.